I'm Elena Rodriguez, 31, and I've spent the last 9 years as a senior intelligence analyst for the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Last Tuesday, my supervisor handed me a USB drive containing Operation BLACKOUT, a directive to plant fabricated evidence linking 3 American journalists to foreign terrorist funding. These weren't enemy combatants or suspicious individuals. They were reporters investigating defense contractor corruption, and the evidence I was ordered to create would destroy their careers and send them to federal prison for decades. When I saw the name Sarah Chen on the target list, the Pulitzer Prize winner who exposed the water crisis in my hometown, my hands started shaking. The agency that recruited me straight out of Georgetown to serve my country was now asking me to silence the very people holding our government accountable. The conspiracy behind this order reaches higher than you could ever imagine. Like and subscribe if you believe journalists should expose the truth, not disappear because of it. The USB drive sat on my desk like a loaded weapon, but my mind drifted back to where this all began. 18 years old, sitting in my childhood bedroom in Riverside, California, holding a cream-colored envelope with the CIA seal. The recruitment letter felt heavy in my trembling hands, heavier than the acceptance letters from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey that lay scattered across my desk. "Congratulations, Miss Rodriguez," the letter began. "Your exceptional academic performance and demonstrated commitment to public service have identified you as an ideal candidate for our intelligence analysis program. The Central Intelligence Agency seeks individuals of your caliber to help protect American interests and democratic values worldwide." I remember reading those words over and over, my father's voice echoing from the kitchen where he was arguing with my mother about overtime pay cuts at the plant. My parents had sacrificed everything for my education, working double shifts so I could attend Georgetown on partial scholarship. The private sector offers would have made me wealthy, but they wouldn't have made me proud. Professor Williams had approached me during my senior seminar on international relations. Distinguished, silver-haired, with eyes that seemed to see through everything, he'd pulled me aside after class one autumn afternoon. "Elena, have you given thought to public service after graduation?" he'd asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the world's secrets. "I've considered the State Department," I'd replied, naive to the real question being asked. He smiled knowingly. "There are other ways to serve your country, ways that require intelligence, discretion, and moral courage. Would you be interested in learning more?" That conversation led to months of discreet interviews, psychological evaluations, and background checks that dug into every corner of my life. They interviewed my high school teachers, my college roommates, even my first boyfriend. The process was thorough, invasive, and somehow thrilling. The final interview took place in a nondescript office building in Rosslyn. 3 people sat across from me, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, a younger man who took notes constantly, and Professor Williams, who, I now understood, was more than just an academic. "Why do you want to work for the CIA, Miss Rodriguez?" the woman had asked. I thought about my father's calloused hands, my mother's tired eyes, the way they'd both lit up when I'd graduated summa cum laude. Because someone has to stand between the American people and the threats they'll never see coming. Because democracy isn't self-sustaining. It requires people willing to sacrifice for something bigger than themselves. The younger man looked up from his notes. "And if we asked you to do something that conflicted with your personal beliefs? I'd hope you'd never ask me to do something that truly conflicted with American values," I'd answered. "But I understand that protecting this country sometimes requires difficult decisions." How naive I'd been. How absolutely, completely naive. The orientation at Langley was everything I'd dreamed of. Glass buildings rising from Virginia forests. American flags snapping in the breeze. Men and women in suits walking with purpose. I felt like I was entering a sacred space, a temple to American security. My training class was diverse. Former military officers, recent graduates like myself, career government employees looking for advancement. We learned about threats I'd never imagined, technologies that seemed like science fiction, and the weight of secrets that could destabilize governments. "You are the thin blue line," our instructor had told us on the first day. "Between chaos and order, between freedom and tyranny. Everything you do here serves that mission." I believed every word. God help me, I believed every single word. Now, staring at that USB drive, I wondered when exactly the mission had changed. When had protecting American freedom become silencing American voices? When had the thin blue line become a weapon pointed At our own citizens? The recruitment letter was still in my apartment, tucked between the pages of my Georgetown diploma. Both documents that once filled me with pride now felt like evidence of my own complicity in something I was only beginning to understand. 9 years. That's how long I'd been climbing the ranks at Langley. And until last Tuesday, I'd been proud of every single day. My cubicle wall was decorated with commendations, including the one that meant the most, a certificate signed by the director himself. For my work preventing the 2019 Christmas bombing in Chicago, I remembered that case like it was yesterday. 3 months of 16-hour days, sifting through intercepted communications, financial records, and surveillance footage. The breakthrough came at a.m. on a Tuesday, when I noticed an anomaly in a wire transfer that everyone else had missed. $500 sent from a Beirut bank to a Chicago hardware store, buried among thousands of legitimate transactions. That $500 led us to Ahmad Mansouri, a radicalized engineering student who'd been planning to detonate a truck bomb outside Millennium Park during the Christmas market. We arrested him 18 hours before the attack. The FBI estimated he could have killed over 300 people. David Kruger had been the one to deliver the commendation to my desk. He was different then, or maybe I was different then. Younger, more idealistic, more willing to see the good in the system that had given a working-class kid from Riverside a chance to serve her country. Outstanding work, Rodriguez, he'd said, his smile genuine. This is exactly why we do what we do. Real people, real lives saved. I'd kept that certificate on my desk for years. It reminded me on the difficult days, when the bureaucracy felt overwhelming, or when I questioned whether my analysis actually mattered, that I was making a difference. I was one of the good guys. My career trajectory had been steady, but not spectacular. Senior intelligence analyst by age 28, with a specialty in counterterrorism financing. I'd developed a reputation for finding patterns others missed, for connecting dots across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. My reports had been cited in briefings to the president, though I'd never been in the room when they were presented. The work consumed everything. I'd dated sporadically, but never seriously. How do you explain to someone that you can't talk about your job, that you might disappear for weeks at a time, that the stress of knowing about threats you can't discuss publicly makes you wake up at a.m. in cold sweats? My parents worried about me. During our monthly phone calls, my mother would ask about my social life, my father would ask about career advancement, and I'd deflect both questions with vague reassurances about being busy with important work. Mija, you work too much, my mother would say. You need to find balance. But there was no balance in this job. There were only threats and countermeasures, patterns and anomalies, the constant knowledge that somewhere, someone was planning to hurt innocent people. And it was my job to stop them. I'd sacrificed relationships, hobbies, even basic human connections. For this work, I ate dinner at my desk more often than at home. I took work calls during family gatherings. I'd miss my college roommate's wedding because of a time-sensitive intelligence report. The sacrifice felt worth it when I could point to concrete results. The Chicago bombing, the financial network we'd dismantled in 2021 that was funding terror. Cells across 3 continents. The early warning I'd provided that helped foil a plot against a synagogue in Miami. But lately, the victories felt smaller, the threats more ambiguous. We were spending increasing amounts of time on domestic surveillance, monitoring American citizens whose only crime was asking uncomfortable questions about government policies. The targets were shifting from foreign terrorists to domestic dissidents, from clear enemies to murkier threats. I'd raised concerns about this shift during my annual review 6 months ago. Kruger had been understanding but firm. The threat landscape is evolving, Elena, he'd explained. Foreign actors are increasingly using domestic proxies. We can't maintain the artificial distinction between foreign and domestic threats anymore. The Constitution is just a piece of paper if we're not alive to defend it. I'd accepted his reasoning then. I'd trusted his judgment, trusted the system, trusted that we were still the good guys, protecting democracy from those who would destroy it. Now looking at that USB drive, I realized how gradually the mission had changed, how slowly we'd moved from protecting Americans to targeting them, how efficiently we'd convinced ourselves that the ends justified any means. The commendation certificate suddenly felt like a relic from a different era, when the enemy was clear and the mission was simple, when saving lives was the goal, not destroying them. I pulled out my desk drawer and looked at the photo I kept hidden there, my parents at my Georgetown graduation, their faces glowing with pride. They'd believed I was serving something noble, something pure. What would they think of me now? Sarah Chen's name on that target list hit me like a physical blow, because I knew exactly who she was. Not just as a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, but as the woman who had saved my hometown when no one else would listen. Riverside, California. 2018. I was already 3 years into my CIA career, but I still called home every Sunday. That's when my mother first mentioned the strange taste in their tap water. "It's bitter, Mija," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular worry that only mothers possess. "And it leaves this film on the dishes. Your father says I'm imagining things, but the Hernandez family next door, their little boy has been getting sick. For months, the complaints piled up. Families reporting stomach problems, skin rashes, children with persistent coughs. The city council dismissed the concerns. All water quality tests are within acceptable parameters," they'd announced at town halls, waving official documents that meant nothing to families watching their children suffer. The local newspaper barely covered the story. A few paragraphs buried on page 6, quoting city officials who insisted there was no problem. The residents of Riverside's working-class neighborhoods, predominantly Latino families like mine, were treated as if they were hysterical, uneducated, making mountains out of molehills. That's when Sarah Chen arrived. I first heard about her from my mother during one of our Sunday calls. "There's this reporter here, Elena, Asian woman, very professional. She's been going door to door, talking to families, taking water samples. She actually listens." Sarah Chen wasn't some small-town journalist looking for a local scoop. She was an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, already known for her work exposing corporate malfeasance. But she'd heard about Riverside through a network of environmental activists and decided to investigate personally. What she found changed everything. I still have the newspaper clipping, printed and mailed to me by my proud mother. The headline read, "Chemical Cover-Up, How Riverside Industries Poisoned a California Community." The byline, Sarah Chen. Her investigation revealed that Riverside Industrial Processing, a subsidiary of a major chemical manufacturer, had been illegally dumping hexavalent chromium into the groundwater supply for over 5 years. The same chemical that had poisoned Hinckley, California, in the case that made Erin Brockovich famous. But Sarah's reporting went deeper than just the environmental crime. She traced the cover-up to city officials who had been receiving campaign contributions from the company. She found internal documents showing that executives knew about the contamination, but had calculated that paying occasional fines was cheaper than proper disposal. Most damning of all, she discovered that the company had hired a public relations firm to discredit community activists, portraying them as troublemakers and conspiracy theorists. The same families who were watching their children get sick were being painted as unreliable witnesses to their own suffering. Sarah's article didn't just expose the crime, it gave names, dates, dollar amounts. She showed how much money changed hands, which officials knew what and when, and exactly how the cover-up had been orchestrated. Her reporting was meticulous, unassailable, and devastating. The response was immediate. Federal EPA investigators arrived within a week. Criminal charges followed within a month. The company eventually paid out $47 million in settlements to affected families, and 3 city officials went to federal prison. But more than that, Sarah's work had restored my faith in journalism as a guardian of democracy. She'd done what government agencies had failed to do: hold the powerful accountable to the powerless. I remembered calling my mother after the settlements were announced. "Mija, that reporter, Sarah Chen, she saved us," my mother had said, her voice thick with emotion. "The doctors say your father's lung problems will get better now that we have clean water. That woman, she's a hero." I'd felt proud that day. Proud that in America, journalists could still investigate powerful interests. Proud that truth could still triumph over money and influence. Proud that somewhere, someone was watching the watchers. Now, staring at Sarah Chen's name on a CIA target list, I felt sick to my stomach. The woman who had saved my community, who had embodied everything noble about American journalism, was marked for destruction by the agency I served. The irony was crushing. Sarah Chen had exposed a chemical company's conspiracy to poison American families and cover it up. Now my own agency was asking me to fabricate evidence to destroy her credibility and send her to prison. The parallelism was too perfect to be accidental. Sarah Chen specialized in exposing powerful interests who harmed ordinary Americans and then covered it up. The journalists on Operation BLACKOUT's target list were all investigating defense contractor corruption, powerful interests harming ordinary Americans and covering it up. We weren't targeting journalists who were threats to national security. We were targeting journalists who were threats to the profit margins of companies that fed at the government trough. I pulled up Sarah's recent articles on my computer. 3 months of meticulous reporting on Meridian Defense Corporation's overcharging for weapons systems that didn't work, their safety violations that had killed American soldiers, their web of political donations and lobbying expenditures. The same fearless reporting that had saved my hometown was now putting her in the crosshairs of my own agency. How had I become part of the system she was trying to expose? How had the CIA become the enemy of the truth instead of its guardian? The USB drive seemed to mock me from my desk. Inside it were the tools to destroy the person who had saved my family, fabricated evidence to silence the voice that had spoken. For the voiceless, I thought about my father's improved breathing, my mother's relief when the water finally ran clear, the children in my old neighborhood who could play outside again without getting sick, all because one journalist had decided that truth mattered more than comfort, that justice mattered more than profit, that ordinary people deserve someone to fight for them. Now that same journalist needed someone to fight for her. The question was, would I have the courage to be that person? I waited until the office emptied before plugging the USB drive into my secure workstation. The encrypted file directory that opened was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evil, organized with the same methodical precision we used to track actual terrorists. 3 main folders: Chen, Sarah Target Alpha, Web, Marcus Target Beta, Kumar, Priya Target Charlie. Each folder contained identical subfolder structures: financial fabrication, communication logs, evidence placement, timeline execution, and legal outcomes. The clinical organization made my skin crawl. These weren't enemy combatants being neutralized, these were American citizens being systematically destroyed. I opened Sarah Chen's folder first, my hands trembling as I clicked through the files. The financial fabrication subfolder contained fabricated bank records showing wire transfers from accounts allegedly linked to Iranian intelligence services. $50,000 deposited into her personal checking account over 6 months, with memo lines reading research assistants and consulting fees. The communications logs were even more sophisticated. Fake email exchanges between Sarah and fictitious contacts with names like Ahmad al-Rashid and Dmitry Volkov. The messages discussed upcoming articles and sensitive information in language carefully crafted to suggest espionage without being explicitly treasonous. But it was the evidence placement documentation that made me physically nauseous. Detailed plans for how and when to plant the fabricated evidence. Digital forensics teams would discover the fake financial records during a routine cybersecurity audit. The fabricated emails would be intercepted through NSA surveillance programs and coincidentally flagged for review. The timeline was ruthlessly efficient. Phase 1, plant digital evidence over 2 weeks. Phase 2, anonymous tip to FBI about suspicious financial activity. Phase 3, federal investigation and media leaks about journalist under investigation for foreign contacts. Phase 4, arrest and indictment within 60 days. Marcus Webb's folder revealed a different approach but identical sophistication. The former Marine turned investigative reporter who specialized in defense contractor fraud was being framed for accepting payments from Russian intelligence operatives. The fabricated evidence showed $75,000 in cryptocurrency transactions from wallets allegedly controlled by the GRU. Webb's fake communications were particularly cruel. The fabricated exchanges showed him allegedly sharing classified information about American weapons systems, information he couldn't possibly have accessed as a civilian journalist. But the documents made it appear as if he'd been recruited as a Russian asset while investigating defense contracts, turning his legitimate journalistic work into evidence of treason. Priya Kumar's targeting was perhaps the most elaborate. The financial journalist who had been exposing Pentagon budget irregularities was being framed for accepting payments from Chinese intelligence. The fabricated evidence showed a complex web of shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets, all leading back to accounts allegedly controlled by China's Ministry of State Security. What made Kumar's frame-up particularly insidious was how it exploited Existing prejudices. The documentation noted that her Indian heritage would make accusations of foreign allegiance more credible to juries and that her previous criticism of American foreign policy could be recontextualized as evidence of anti-American sentiment. Each target folder contains psychological profiles that read like intelligence assessments of enemy agents. Sarah Chen was described as methodical, persistent, with strong moral convictions that make her unlikely to cease investigations under pressure. Marcus Webb was characterized as militarily trained, suspicious of authority, with combat experience that makes him potentially dangerous if cornered. The profiles weren't just character assassinations, they were operational planning documents. They outlined each journalist's personal vulnerabilities, family relationships, financial pressures, and psychological weaknesses that could be exploited during interrogation and prosecution. But the most chilling document was buried in a shared folder labeled Strategic Objectives. It was a memo explaining the broader purpose of Operation Blackout, the systematic neutralization of journalists investigating defense contractor irregularities. Serves dual purposes: elimination of immediate threats to ongoing procurement processes, and establishment of deterrent effect for future investigations. The memo continued, post-prosecution media coverage will emphasize the dangers of foreign infiltration of American journalism, reinforcing public support for expanded surveillance authorities and reduced press freedoms. Secondary objective: discrediting ongoing defense contractor investigations by associating them with foreign espionage activities. This wasn't just about silencing 3 journalists. This was about weaponizing their destruction to justify broader attacks on press freedom. Their prosecutions would be used as propaganda to convince the American public that investigative journalism itself was a national security threat. The technical sophistication was staggering. Digital fingerprints had been meticulously crafted to make the fabricated evidence appear authentic under forensic examination. Timestamps had been backdated using advanced techniques. Financial records had been inserted into bank databases using methods that would be virtually impossible to detect. Whoever had designed this operation understood both intelligence tradecraft and legal evidence standards. They knew exactly what prosecutors would need to secure convictions and exactly how to manufacture that evidence convincingly. I scrolled through execution timelines, communication protocols, and contingency plans. Every detail had been considered, every possibility anticipated. The operation was scheduled to begin in 72 hours with the first evidence placement. By Christmas, 3 of America's most important investigative journalists would be in federal custody, facing charges that could put them in prison for decades. Their careers would be destroyed, their sources would be compromised, and their ongoing investigations would be discredited. The defense contractors they'd been investigating would continue overcharging the Pentagon, selling defective equipment to American soldiers, and funneling taxpayer money into private profits. The corruption would continue, hidden behind a wall of manufactured national security concerns. As I closed the final folder, I realized the full scope of what I was being asked to participate in. This wasn't intelligence work, it was the weaponization of intelligence capabilities against American democracy itself. The USB drive contained everything needed to destroy 3 lives and cripple American journalism's ability to hold power accountable. All I had to do was follow orders. But Sarah Chen's face kept flashing in my mind, the woman who had saved my hometown, who had stood up for families like mine when no one else would listen. How could I destroy the person who had embodied everything I thought I was serving? The next morning, I accessed my intelligence databases to understand what exactly these journalists had been investigating. What I found made Operation Blackout's true purpose crystal clear. Meridian Defense Corporation wasn't just another defense contractor, it was a $50 billion behemoth that had become synonymous with Pentagon waste and fraud. Their classified contract portfolio read like a catalog of American military incompetence. The F-47 fighter jet program that was 7 years behind schedule and $30 billion over budget. The naval communications system that didn't work in saltwater environments. The body armor that failed ballistic testing but was deployed to soldiers anyway. Sarah Chen's investigation had been methodically documenting a pattern of deliberate fraud. Her articles showed how Meridian had submitted false test results for their new rifle system, claiming 99.7% reliability when internal documents showed a 23% failure rate in combat conditions. American soldiers in Syria had died when their weapons jammed during firefights, but Meridian had blamed user error and inadequate maintenance. The financial web was even more damning. Chen had traced $47 million in campaign contributions from Meridian executives to members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees over the past 6 years. She'd found receipts for $2.3 million in lobbying expenses, including luxury vacations for congressional staff disguised as educational seminars at five-star resorts. Most explosive of all, she'd obtained internal Meridian emails discussing the revolving door strategy, systematically hiring former Pentagon officials and congressional staffers at triple their government salaries, then using their connections to secure contracts for weapons systems the military didn't want or need. Marcus Webb's investigation had taken a different angle, focusing on Meridian's safety violations that had killed American service members. His reporting revealed that Meridian had known about defects in their mine-resistant vehicles for 18 months before the explosions that killed 6 Marines in Afghanistan. Internal safety reports had recommended immediate recalls, but executives had calculated that wrongful death settlements would cost less than production delays. Webb had obtained testimony from former Meridian engineers describing how quality control reports were routinely falsified, how safety tests were manipulated, and how whistleblowers were systematically fired and blacklisted from the defense industry. His sources described a corporate culture where profits mattered more than the lives of the soldiers who depended on their equipment. Priya Kumar's financial journalism had exposed the Pentagon's complicity in the fraud. Her investigation showed how Defense Department auditors had identified Meridian's overcharging patterns years ago but had been pressured by political appointees to minimize their findings. She documented how contracts were written with deliberately vague specifications that allowed Meridian to claim additional payments for basic functionality. Kumar had also revealed the international dimension of the corruption. Meridian was selling inferior weapons to NATO allies at premium prices while using their political connections to block competitors from bidding on international contracts. American taxpayers were subsidizing a company that was cheating our closest allies and undermining international military cooperation. Together, the 3 journalists had assembled a comprehensive picture of systemic corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Their combined reporting showed how Meridian Defense had essentially purchased a captive customer in the Pentagon using political donations and lobbying to secure contracts regardless of their product's quality or price. But the most damaging revelation was still unreported. I found references in classified briefings to something called the Afghanistan Papers, internal Meridian documents showing that company executives had known their equipment would fail in desert conditions but had shipped it anyway to meet contractual deadlines. The failure of Meridian communications equipment had directly contributed to the deaths of 17 American soldiers in a single engagement when units couldn't coordinate their positions. These documents were scheduled to be leaked to all 3 journalists within the next month, according to intelligence intercepts I accessed. The leak would have provided documentary proof of corporate manslaughter on a massive scale and potentially triggered criminal prosecutions of Meridian executives. Operation Blackout wasn't just about silencing inconvenient journalism, it was about preventing the exposure of evidence that could bring down one of the defense industry's most powerful companies and the political network that protected it. I pulled up Meridian's stock price over the past year. Despite the negative coverage, their share value had increased 34%, driven by new contract awards that seemed to accelerate in direct proportion to the critical journalism about their performance. The worse their weapons performed, the more contracts they received to fix the problems they'd created. The company's board of directors read like a who's who of former government officials: 3 former defense secretaries, 2 former CIA directors, 5 retired four-star generals, and a dozen former congressional staffers. They weren't just selling weapons to the government, they were the government, monetizing their public service through a revolving door that turned patriotism into profit. Their lobbying disclosure forms showed meetings with 47 senators and 127 House members in the past year alone. The topics of discussion were always listed as national security matters and defense procurement policy, but the real agenda was obvious: ensuring that contracts kept flowing regardless of performance, cost, or body count. I thought about the Marines who had died when their Meridian-built vehicles failed to protect them from improvised explosives. I thought about the Air Force pilots flying jets that couldn't perform their basic missions. I thought about the infantry soldiers whose rifles jammed in combat because Meridian had faked their reliability tests. These weren't abstract policy failures, they were American service members who had died because a corporation prioritized profits over their lives, and because government officials prioritized campaign contributions over their constitutional duties. Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar weren't threats to national security. They were the only people holding accountable a system that was getting Americans killed while enriching the politically connected, and my agency wanted to destroy them to protect that system. The USB drive suddenly felt like evidence of treason, not by the journalists, but by the people who had created Operation Blackout. We weren't protecting America from its enemies. We were protecting America's enemies from accountability. The question was, what was I going to do about it? David Kruger appeared at my cubicle Thursday morning with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder that made my stomach drop. His usual casual demeanor was replaced by something harder, more calculating. Elena, my office. Now. His corner office overlooked the Potomac, with framed photos of him shaking hands with 3 different CIA directors and a signed baseball from the Washington Nationals. I'd been in this office dozens of times for briefings and performance reviews, but today it felt different, smaller, more like an interrogation room. "How's the blackout analysis progressing?" he asked, settling behind his desk with practiced authority. "I'm still reviewing the materials," I said carefully. "There's a lot to process." Kruger opened the manila folder and pulled out a document I recognized with growing dread, my annual performance review from 6 months ago. But this wasn't the version I'd signed. Red ink annotations covered the margins, with new comments that questioned my reliability and commitment to organizational objectives. "I've been reconsidering your performance metrics," he said, sliding the document across the desk. "There are some concerning patterns here." I scanned the fabricated annotations. Displays excessive emotional attachment to analytical subjects, questions operational priorities without sufficient justification, may lack the psychological resilience for sensitive assignments. "David, these comments weren't in my original review," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Performance evaluations are living documents, Elena. They evolve as we gather more data about an analyst's capabilities." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "The question is whether you want this review to reflect someone who rises to meet challenging assignments, or someone who lacks the moral courage to serve her country when it matters most." The threat was unmistakable. My security clearance, my career, my entire professional identity hung on my willingness to participate in Operation Blackout. "I've always been willing to serve my country," I said. "But targeting American journalists, these aren't journalists, Elena. They're security threats who happen to have press credentials." Kruger pulled out another folder, this one marked with classification stamps I'd never seen before. "What you don't know about these individuals would shock you." He spread out surveillance photos of Sarah Chen meeting with sources, Marcus Webb interviewing former military personnel, and Priya Kumar reviewing documents in what appeared to be a public library. "Chen has been in contact with foreign intelligence operatives for months," Kruger said, pointing to a photo of Sarah talking to a man in a coffee shop. "Webb has been soliciting classified information from active duty personnel. Kumar has been working with hackers to access secured government databases." I studied the photos, my intelligence training kicking in automatically. The images were real, but the context was manufactured. Sarah's foreign operative looked like a middle-aged businessman in a rumpled suit. Webb's active duty personnel appeared to be wearing civilian clothes in what looked like a veterans support group meeting. Kumar's hackers were sitting in what appeared to be a university computer lab. "These photos don't prove what you're suggesting," I said. Kruger's expression hardened. "Elena, I've known you for years. You're one of our most talented analysts, which is why you were selected for this assignment. But talent without loyalty is worse than useless, it's dangerous." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Do you know what happened to Jennifer Walsh?" I knew Jennifer Walsh. She'd been a senior analyst in the Middle East division who'd raised concerns about intelligence being manipulated to justify military interventions. She'd been reassigned to a desk job processing visa applications, then quietly forced into early retirement when her security clearance was revoked. Jennifer asked too many questions about operations above her pay grade, Kruger continued. She thought she knew better than people who'd been serving this country since before she was born. Now she's teaching high school social studies in Vermont. The message was clear: cooperate or face professional destruction. I need to understand the full scope of what we're asking these journalists to account for, I said, trying a different approach. If they're genuinely compromised, there must be substantial evidence beyond these photos. Kruger studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be classified communications intercepts. Chen received $50,000 from accounts linked to Iranian intelligence, he said, showing me financial records. That looked identical to the fabricated evidence I'd seen on the USB drive. Webb has been sharing classified defense information with Russian contacts. Kumar has been passing Pentagon budget data to Chinese operatives. I realized he was showing me the same fabricated evidence as if it were real intelligence. Either Kruger genuinely believed the fake evidence was authentic, or he was testing whether I would accept it without question. Where did this intelligence originate? I asked. Multiple sources, multiple agencies. NSA, FBI, Treasury Department Financial Intelligence. This isn't speculation, Elena, it's a coordinated intelligence assessment spanning months of investigation. But I'd seen the fabrication folders. I knew this evidence had been manufactured, not collected, which meant either Kruger was lying to me or someone was lying to him. The evidence is compelling, I said carefully, but the method of neutralization seems extreme. Couldn't we approach them directly, offer immunity in exchange for cooperation? Kruger shook his head. These aren't confused patriots who made bad choices, Elena. They're actively working against American interests. The only question is whether we stop them quietly through controlled prosecution or wait for them to cause catastrophic damage to national security. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the Virginia landscape where America's intelligence apparatus had grown from a small wartime organization into a sprawling bureaucracy that employed more people than some small countries. I recruited you because I believed you understood that serving this country sometimes requires difficult choices, he said without turning around. That protecting American lives sometimes means making hard decisions about American liberties. When he turned back to face me, his expression was almost paternal. Elena, I'm not asking you to betray your principles. I'm asking you to understand that your principles must serve a larger purpose. These three individuals are threats to operations that protect millions of Americans. Your conscience is important, but it can't be more important than your duty. He returned to his desk and closed the folders. You have 48 hours to complete the blackout analysis and provide implementation recommendations. I trust you will make the right choice. As I walked back to my cubicle, the weight of his expectations pressed down on me like a physical force. I understood the choice I was being offered: destroy 3 journalists or watch my own career be destroyed in retaliation. But there was a third option Kruger hadn't considered. What if I warned them? That night, I stayed in the office until the cleaning crew arrived. The building felt different after hours, the hum of servers more noticeable, the security cameras more obvious, the weight of secrets more oppressive. I'd always found comfort in the late-night quiet of Langley, but tonight every shadow seemed to hide surveillance. Using my analyst credentials, I began investigating the investigator. David Kruger's personnel file painted the picture of a model intelligence officer. Georgetown Law, Army Intelligence, 23 years of distinguished service across multiple divisions, 3 commendations for exceptional service, including one for his work disrupting a terrorist financing network in 2017. But personnel files only told official stories. I needed to understand the unofficial ones. I accessed the financial disclosure forms that all senior CIA officers were required to file annually. Standard investments, a modest retirement portfolio, a mortgage on a house in McLean that was within his salary range. Nothing suspicious on the surface. Then I dug deeper, using techniques I'd learned for tracking terrorist financing networks. I cross-referenced his wife's maiden name, his children's social security numbers, and property records going back 10 years. What I found made my blood run cold. Helen Kruger, David's wife, had received consulting payments totaling $347,000 over the past 3 years from Strategic Communications International, a public relations firm that specialized in reputation management for defense contractors. The payments were listed as communications consulting for amounts just under the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic reviews. Strategic Communications International's client list was a who's who of defense contractors, including Meridian Defense Corporation. Helen Kruger had no background in communications or public relations. She was a retired elementary school teacher. But she was receiving substantial payments from a company that helped defense contractors manage negative publicity. I pulled up the property records for the Kruger family's vacation home in the Hamptons, purchased 2 years ago for $1.8 million cash. David's government salary, even at the senior executive service level, couldn't have supported that purchase. The down payment had come from a family trust that traced back to Helen's consulting income. The pattern became clearer as I expanded my search. David Kruger's brother-in-law had been hired as a senior advisor by Meridian Defense Corporation 6 months ago, despite having no aerospace or defense experience. His previous job had been managing a sporting goods store in Omaha, but the most damning evidence was buried in classified cable traffic. I found a series of communications between Kruger and contacts at Meridian Defense that had been disguised as routine security briefings. The cables discuss threats to ongoing operations and media management strategies in language that seemed more appropriate for corporate crisis management than national security briefings. One cable from last month contained a phrase that made my hands shake: recommend immediate neutralization of media threats to Project Hercules prior to congressional hearings. Project Hercules was Meridian's code name for their new fighter jet program, the same program Sarah Chen had been investigating. I cross-referenced the dates of these communications with the timeline for Operation BLACKOUT. The correlation was perfect. Kruger had been coordinating with Meridian Defense to identify and neutralize journalistic threats to their business interests, then using CIA resources to manufacture evidence against those journalists. My supervisor wasn't just compromised, he was actively working as an agent for the defense contractor he was supposed to be protecting America from. I pulled up the building's security camera system, using my analyst access to review footage from the past month. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Kruger had been meeting regularly with individuals who weren't in any government database, private citizens who entered the building using visitor badges but never appeared in official meeting logs. One face appeared repeatedly: Thomas Morrison, Meridian Defense Corporation's vice president for government relations. Morrison had been visiting Kruger's office twice a week for the past month, always after normal business hours, always using temporary security badges that wouldn't create permanent records. The security footage showed Morrison carrying briefcases into these meetings and leaving empty-handed. I couldn't prove what was in those briefcases, but the pattern suggested regular information exchanges between my supervisor and a defense contractor executive. I accessed Morrison's background through our corporate intelligence database. Former CIA operations officer, retired 8 years ago to join Meridian Defense at a salary 4 times his government pay. He specialized in strategic intelligence consulting, which seemed to mean using his former agency connections to gather information that helped his corporate employer. The revolving door between intelligence agencies and defense contractors wasn't news, but this was different. This was an active intelligence officer providing operational support to a private corporation, using CIA resources to attack American journalists who threaten corporate profits. I found emails between Kruger and Morrison discussing Project BLACKOUT that predated the official operation by 6 weeks. Meridian Defense had essentially commissioned the CIA to destroy their critics, and my supervisor had been happy to oblige, but the conspiracy reached beyond just Kruger. I found similar patterns of communication between other CIA officers and defense contractor executives. What I had assumed was an isolated case of corruption was actually part of a systematic infiltration of the intelligence community by private interests. ATM. I made a discovery that changed everything. Buried in classified budget documents was a line item for $50 million in contractor support services provided by Strategic Communications International to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. We weren't just compromised by defense contractors, we were literally paying them to help us target their critics. The same public relations firm that was paying Kruger's wife was receiving tens of millions of dollars in CIA contracts to provide strategic communications support. They were being paid by taxpayers to attack taxpayers who asked uncomfortable questions about how their tax money was being spent. I printed the most damning documents and hid them in my personal bag, knowing that my computer access was monitored and that digital evidence could be altered or deleted. If something happened to me, I wanted physical proof of what I'd discovered. As I prepared to leave, I realized I was no longer just facing a moral choice about 3 journalists. I was facing evidence of systematic corruption that reached to the highest levels of the intelligence community. David Kruger wasn't just my supervisor asking me to compromise my principles. He was a compromised agent working for foreign interests, not foreign governments, but foreign corporations that had purchased their own private intelligence service within the CIA. The question was no longer whether I would warn Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar. The question was whether I would survive long enough to expose the entire conspiracy. As I walked through the empty corridors of Langley toward the parking garage, I felt eyes watching me from every security camera, every darkened office, every shadow. For the first time in 9 years, I was afraid of my own agency. I couldn't sleep that night, so I spent the dark hours researching Marcus Webb, the first journalist whose life I was supposed to destroy. What I found made my complicity in Operation Blackout feel like a betrayal not just of press freedom, but of everything I'd claimed to believe about serving those who serve. Marcus Webb, 42, former Marine Corps captain, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star with V device for Valor Under Fire. He'd left the military in 2019 after his unit was ambushed using faulty communications equipment that failed to coordinate air support. 3 Marines died in that engagement, including his radio operator, a 19-year-old kid from Tennessee named Jimmy Rodriguez. No relation to me, but the shared name made it personal anyway. Webb's transition to journalism hadn't been driven by ambition or career advancement. According to interviews I found in military publications, he'd become a reporter specifically to investigate the equipment failures that had killed his men. His first article, published in Military Times, was titled "When Good Marines Die From Bad Gear: A Captain's Quest for Accountability." The article was devastating in its technical precision. Webb had used his military expertise to analyze the communications equipment failure that had cost 3 lives, showing how Meridian Defense Corporation's radio systems had a documented pattern of breaking down in desert conditions. The company had known about the problem for 18 months, but had continued shipping defective equipment to combat zones. Webb's investigation revealed that the radios failed because Meridian had used substandard components to increase profit margins, then falsified environmental testing data to hide the defects. When the radios broke down during the ambush, Webb's unit couldn't call for air support, couldn't coordinate with neighboring units, couldn't even call for medical evacuation. Jimmy Rodriguez bled out in my arms while our medic tried to radio for a helicopter that couldn't hear us, Webb had written. He was 19 years old, planning to use his GI benefits to become a teacher. He died because executives in air-conditioned boardrooms decided that their quarterly profits mattered more than his life. The article had launched Webb's journalism career, but it wasn't driven by professional ambition. Every subsequent investigation he'd conducted was connected to military equipment failures that had killed or wounded American service members. He wasn't just a reporter, he was a witness seeking justice for fallen comrades. I pulled up his most recent articles. Over the past 2 years, Webb had documented 17 separate cases where Meridian defense equipment had failed in combat, resulting in 43 American casualties. His reporting was methodical, technically precise, and devastating to the company's reputation. But what made Webb particularly dangerous to Meridian wasn't just his journalistic skills, it was his credibility. He wasn't some civilian reporter speculating about military equipment. He was a decorated veteran who understood the equipment intimately, who had seen it fail firsthand, who could speak with authority about the consequences of corporate negligence. Webb's sources were current and former military personnel who trusted him because he'd served alongside them. They shared classified information with him not to betray their country, but to protect their fellow service members from equipment they knew was defective. The fabricated evidence that would destroy Webb was particularly cruel because it exploited his legitimate military connections. The fake communications logs showed him allegedly soliciting classified information from active duty personnel, but in reality, he was receiving warnings about equipment problems from soldiers who trusted him to expose the truth. His alleged Russian contacts were actually former military contractors who had worked on Meridian defense projects and were willing to speak on the record about safety violations they'd witnessed. The cryptocurrency payments supposedly from Russian intelligence were actually crowd-funded donations from veterans organizations supporting his investigative work. Everything legitimate about Webb's journalism was being twisted into evidence of treason. His military service was being used against him. His commitment to protecting current service members was being weaponized to destroy him. I found a video interview Webb had given to a military podcast 6 months ago. Sitting in what appeared to be a modest apartment, wearing a simple button-down shirt, he'd spoken with quiet intensity about his motivation. People ask me why I don't just move on, why I keep investigating defense contractors instead of covering other stories, he'd said. The answer is simple. Jimmy Rodriguez can't speak for himself anymore. Neither can the other 42 service members who died because of defective equipment. Someone has to be their voice. The interviewer had asked about threats he'd received from defense contractors. They've tried everything, Webb had replied. Lawsuits, private investigators, attempts to discredit my military service. But they can't change the fact that their equipment failed and good Marines died. They can attack me all they want, I'm still breathing. Jimmy Rodriguez isn't. I thought about the fabricated evidence on the USB drive, about how Webb's quest for justice would be reframed as treachery, about how his attempt to protect American soldiers would be used to imprison him for decades. Then I thought about something else: Webb's military training. Unlike Sarah Chen and Priya Kumar, Marcus Webb had been trained to detect surveillance, to recognize threats, to survive hostile environments. If anyone on the target list might survive what was coming, it would be him, but that also made him more dangerous to the conspiracy. A decorated Marine veteran imprisoned on fabricated treason charges would become a cause célèbre for military communities. His prosecution would draw attention to exactly the kind of defense contractor corruption that Operation BLACKOUT was designed to protect. I pulled up Webb's recent financial records through our intelligence databases. He lived modestly on freelance journalism income, drove a 10-year-old Honda, rented a one-bedroom apartment in Arlington. No evidence of the lavish lifestyle that Russian intelligence payments would have provided. His only significant expense was a monthly payment to a veteran's mental health counseling service. The man we were framing as a traitor was struggling with combat PTSD while trying to prevent other veterans from dying due to corporate negligence. He was living paycheck to paycheck while investigating multi-billion-dollar fraud. He was sacrificing his own stability to protect the military community that had shaped his life. Marcus Webb embodied everything I'd thought the CIA was supposed to protect: American service members, military integrity, accountability for those who profited from national defense. Instead, we were preparing to destroy him to protect the very corruption he was exposing. I looked at the clock. 4:47 a.m. In less than 48 hours, I was supposed to provide implementation recommendations for Operation BLACKOUT. In 72 hours, the evidence planting would begin, but I knew I couldn't participate in destroying Marcus Webb. Not when he was fighting for the same American values I'd sworn to defend. Not when his only crime was seeking justice for fallen Marines. The question was, how could I warn him without exposing myself to the same fate? Friday afternoon, I made the decision that would change my life forever. Sitting in my cubicle, surrounded by the artifacts of 9 years of loyal service, I decided to commit what the CIA would consider treason, warning the targets of an active intelligence operation. But first, I needed to establish secure communications without exposing myself or the journalists to additional surveillance. My intelligence training had taught me how to detect and evade monitoring, but now I was using those skills against my own agency. I started by creating a new email account using a public computer at the Fairfax County Library, registering under the name Alexandra Chen, close enough to Sarah's name to catch her attention, different enough to provide plausible deniability if the account was discovered. I used a VPN service and Tor browser to mask my digital footprint, paying for the VPN with a prepaid credit card purchased with cash. The message to Sarah Chen had to be carefully crafted. Too vague, and she might dismiss it as a prank. Too specific, and I might reveal information that only a CIA analyst would know. I needed to provide enough proof to establish credibility without creating evidence that could be traced back to me. After 3 hours of drafting and redrafting, I sent this message: Miss Chen, your investigation into Meridian Defense Corporation has put you in immediate danger. The CIA is planning to plant fabricated evidence linking you to Iranian intelligence operatives. The operation is called Blackout and targets 3 journalists, you, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar. Fake financial records showing $50,000 in payments from Iranian accounts will be discovered in your bank records within 72 hours. This is not a hoax. Check your secure investigative email into hours for proof. A friend who believes in press freedom. I sent similar messages to Webb and Kumar, customizing the details to match their specific fabricated evidence. Webb's message mentioned The fake Russian cryptocurrency payments. Kumar's referenced the manufactured Chinese intelligence connections, but Sarah Chen was my primary target. Her investigation into Meridian Defense was the most comprehensive, her reporting the most damaging to the company's interests. If I could save only one journalist, it had to be her. 2 hours later, I returned to the library and sent a follow-up message to Sarah's secure email address, one I'd found through intelligence surveillance of her communications. This time, I included attachments that would prove my credibility, screenshots of classified documents showing the fabricated evidence timeline, redacted portions of Operation BLACKOUT's planning documents, and photos of the USB drive itself. Miss Chen, I am a CIA intelligence analyst with 9 years of service. The attached documents prove that Operation BLACKOUT is real and imminent. I cannot reveal my identity without putting myself at extreme risk, but I can provide additional proof of my credentials. Your reporting on Meridian Defense Corporation has exposed corruption that reaches into the highest levels of the intelligence community. They plan to destroy you to protect their profits. Please respond if you receive this message. Time is running out. I waited 36 hours for a response, checking the anonymous email account every few hours from different public computers across Northern Virginia. The silence was agonizing. Had she received the messages? Did she believe them? Was she taking precautions, or had she dismissed my warnings as the ravings of a conspiracy theorist? Sunday evening, checking from a computer at George Mason University, I found her response. Alexandra, if you are who you claim to be, you'll understand why I need verification before acting on information. This explosive. Prove your CIA credentials. By answering this question, what was the code name for the operation that prevented the 2019 Christmas attack in Chicago? Only someone with access to classified counterterrorism files would know this. My hands shook as I typed the response. Revealing operational details would be unquestionable proof of my intelligence access, but it would also be irrefutable evidence of my betrayal if the communications were ever discovered. Miss Chen, the operation was code-named Winter Guardian. The target was Ahmad Mansouri, a radicalized engineering student planning to detonate a truck bomb outside Millennium Park during the Christmas market. The breakthrough came from analysis of a $500 wire transfer from a Beirut bank to a Chicago hardware store. The arrest was made 18 hours before the planned attack. I was the analyst who identified the suspicious transaction. This information has never been made public. Please believe me. You are in immediate danger. Alexandra, her response came within an hour. Alexandra, I believe you. What do you need me to do? Sarah, the relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately replaced by the realization that I had just crossed a line I could never uncross. I was now actively working against my own agency, providing classified information to a civilian, participating in what the CIA would consider an act of treason. But looking at Sarah's simple response, I believe you, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, pride in my actions instead of shame. I typed my response carefully. Sarah, first, assume all your normal communications are compromised. Use only this secure channel or encrypted messaging apps with new accounts. Second, review all your financial records immediately, they may have already planted some evidence. Third, consider leaving the country temporarily while this unfolds. Fourth, contact Marcus Webb and Priya Kumar, they're also targets. Fifth, document everything you can about your Meridian Defense investigation before it's seized as evidence. Sixth, prepare for the possibility that your sources will be exposed and prosecuted. I will provide additional intelligence as the situation develops. Trust no one in government until this is resolved. Alexandra, as I sent the message, I realized I had just recruited my first asset. Sarah Chen was now an intelligence source, and I was running an operation against my own government. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, for the first time in months, I felt like I was actually serving the American people instead of the interests that had captured the agencies meant to protect them. But I also knew that once Operation Blackout discovered their targets had been warned, they would launch an investigation to find the leak. I had perhaps days before they identified me as the source. The countdown to my own exposure had begun. The question was whether I could expose the conspiracy before they silenced me permanently. As I walked out of the university library into the cold Virginia evening, I wondered if I would ever feel safe again. But I also wondered if I had ever really been safe while working for people who would destroy innocent Americans to protect corporate profits. At least now I was fighting for something worth the risk: the truth, the press freedom that protected democracy, and the memory of the woman who had saved my hometown when no one else would listen. Sarah Chen had trusted me enough to believe my warning. Now I had to prove worthy of that trust. Tuesday morning, I received a message that made my blood run cold. Alexandra, I need to meet with you in person. This is bigger than 3 journalists. Can you meet today? Sarah, meeting face to face violated every rule of operational security I'd ever learned. It would create physical evidence of our contact, expose both of us to surveillance, and provide irrefutable proof of my betrayal if we were caught. But Sarah's urgency suggested she'd discovered something that couldn't be communicated through encrypted channels. I spent 2 hours planning the meeting, using techniques I'd learned for asset recruitment in hostile territories. The location had to be public enough to seem innocent, private enough for sensitive conversation, and accessible enough to provide multiple escape routes if we were being monitored. I chose the parking garage at Tyson's Corner Mall, 3 levels, multiple entrances, constant traffic. That would mask our presence. The ambient noise from cars and ventilation systems would defeat most audio surveillance, and the concrete structure would block electronic monitoring. My message to Sarah was brief: 3rd level, northwest corner, PM, come alone, park near the stairwell. If you see anything suspicious, leave immediately and contact me through secure channels. This meeting could destroy both our lives. I arrived 30 minutes early, using the time to conduct counter-surveillance. I walked through each level of the garage, noting security cameras, identifying potential observation positions, memorizing license plates of parked vehicles. My hands were shaking, but my training kicked in automatically. Sarah Chen arrived precisely at PM, driving a modest Honda Accord and wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She parked exactly where I'd instructed and waited 5 minutes before getting out smart operational security for a civilian. I approached her car from behind, having observed her through the stairwell window for 10 minutes to ensure she hadn't been followed. Miss Chen? She turned, and I saw the face that had become familiar from surveillance photos and news articles. But in person, Sarah Chen looked older than her 38 years, with stress lines around her eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to expect threats. You're Alexandra? She asked, not my real name, but yes. I glanced around the garage, checking for new vehicles or suspicious activity. We have maybe 10 minutes before this becomes too dangerous. Sarah pulled a tablet from her bag and handed it to me. Before we discuss your situation, you need to see what I found. Your warning led me to dig deeper into Meridian Defense, and what I discovered changes everything. The tablet displayed financial records I'd never seen before: bank transfers, offshore accounts, and shell company structures that dwarfed anything in my intelligence files. Meridian Defense isn't just overcharging the Pentagon, Sarah said, her voice urgent but controlled. They're running a massive money laundering operation through defense contracts. Look at these accounts. I scrolled through documents showing $2.3 billion in Pentagon payments to Meridian subsidiaries that existed only as P.O. boxes in the Cayman Islands. The money flowed through a complex network of shell companies before disappearing into accounts controlled by individuals whose names I recognize from CIA personnel files. These aren't just corrupt defense contracts, I whispered, the implications hitting me like a physical blow. This is systematic theft of taxpayer money through fabricated defense programs. Sarah nodded grimly. It gets worse. I've traced payments from these accounts to current and former intelligence officials, congressional staffers, Pentagon procurement officers, and defense contractor executives. We're not looking at simple corruption, we're looking at organized criminal enterprise that's looted the defense budget for decades. She showed me more documents: luxury real estate purchases, yacht registrations, private jet expenses, and offshore investment accounts, all funded by money that was supposed to buy equipment for American soldiers. Your supervisor, David Kruger. Sarah continued, he's received over $800,000 through this network over the past 5 years. His wife's consulting payments were just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg. The parking garage suddenly felt like it was closing in around us. I'd thought I was exposing a conspiracy to frame 3 journalists. Instead, I'd stumbled into evidence of a criminal enterprise that had been stealing billions of dollars from American taxpayers while soldiers died from defective equipment. How did you get these documents? I asked. Marcus Webb had a source inside Meridian's accounting department, someone who'd been copying financial records for months. When you warned him about Operation Blackout, he shared everything with me. And Priya Kumar, we've been working together since Sunday to piece this together. I realized the 3 journalists had done something the CIA had failed to do. They'd uncovered a massive financial conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and the intelligence community. There's more, Sarah said, pulling up another file. We've identified 17 current and former CIA officers who've received payments through this network. Operation Blackout isn't just about protecting Meridian Defense from negative publicity, it's about protecting a criminal conspiracy that's stolen billions of dollars. The names on the list included people I worked with daily, supervisors I respected, colleagues I'd trusted with my life. The corruption wasn't limited to David Kruger, it had metastasized throughout the intelligence community. They're not just trying to silence us, Sarah continued. They're trying to prevent exposure of the largest defense contractor fraud in American history. The evidence we've assembled could bring down dozens of high-ranking officials and expose systematic theft that makes Watergate look like petty cash. I stared at the tablet, my worldview crumbling with each document. Everything I'd believed about serving my country, protecting American interests, and working for an organization dedicated to national security had been a lie. The CIA hadn't been infiltrated by corrupt individuals, it had been captured by organized criminals. What do you need from me? I asked. Proof that Operation Blackout is an official CIA operation, Sarah replied. With the evidence we have about the financial conspiracy, plus documentation showing the CIA is actively working to silence journalists investigating it, we can expose the entire network. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos I'd taken of the USB drive and classified documents. I can provide that proof, but once I do, there's no going back. They'll know I'm the leak, and they'll destroy me. Sarah studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent years evaluating sources and judging their credibility. Are you prepared for that? She asked. I thought about my parents, proud of their daughter who served her country. I thought about my colleagues who believed they were protecting America. I thought about the American soldiers who'd died because criminals had stolen the money meant to buy them proper equipment. Yes, I said, but I need your help. What kind of help? I need you to publish this story before they can arrest me. Once Operation Blackout realizes their targets have been warned, they'll move quickly to identify and neutralize the leak. You probably have 48 hours, maybe less, Sarah nodded. We'll be ready. But Elena, hearing my real name in the parking garage made me freeze. How did you? Investigative journalists are good at connecting dots, she said gently. You mentioned the Chicago operation from 2019. There were only 3 analysts who had access to that specific intelligence, and only one who fits the profile of someone who might risk everything to warn us. I realized that in trying to prove my credibility, I'd essentially identified myself. But looking at Sarah Chen, the woman who'd saved my hometown, who was now risking her life to expose systematic corruption, I felt relief instead of fear. Elena Rodriguez, I said, offering my hand. Senior intelligence analyst, CIA Counterterrorism Center, and I'm about to commit treason to save my country. Sarah shook my hand firmly. Sarah Chen, investigative journalist, and I'm about to publish the story that brings down the largest criminal conspiracy in government history. As we parted ways in that parking garage, I understood that I'd just changed the course of my life forever. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was actually serving the oath I'd taken 9 years ago. The truth was worth any price I'd have to pay for it. Wednesday morning felt different. The familiar routines of Langley badge scans, security checkpoints, elevator small talk now seemed like elaborate theater masking criminal enterprise. Every colleague I passed could be part of the conspiracy. Every supervisor could be bought. Every briefing could be a lie designed to protect billions in stolen taxpayer money. I'd agreed to provide Sarah Chen with additional classified documents that would prove Operation Blackout was an official CIA operation. But gathering that evidence while maintaining my cover required careful planning and exceptional operational security. My first target was the electronic trail of communications between Kruger and his CIA conspirators. Using my analyst access, I pulled up interagency message traffic from the past 6 months, searching for references to Operation Blackout, Meridian Defense, or the 3 targeted journalists. What I found exceeded my worst expectations. The conspiracy wasn't limited to a few corrupt individuals, it was a coordinated effort involving multiple CIA divisions, FBI counterintelligence units, and NSA surveillance capabilities. A message thread from 2 months ago showed systematic planning. Blackout targets confirmed for neutralization. CIA division will provide surveillance support. NSA will assist with communications intercepts. Timeline: execution within 90 days of final authorization. The participants list included names I recognized: senior CIA officers, FBI supervisors, NSA liaisons. This wasn't rogue operation by a compromised supervisor, it was interagency coordination at the highest levels. I found budget authorizations showing $12 million allocated for special counterintelligence operations that corresponded exactly with Operation Blackout's timeline. The money was being used to pay for fabricated evidence, surveillance operations, and what the documents euphemistically called information management activities. But the most damning evidence was in communications between CIA officers and their corporate handlers. I found encrypted messages between 17 different intelligence personnel and executives at defense contracting companies, coordinating not just Operation Blackout, but similar operations targeting other journalists, congressional investigators, and government auditors. A message from Kruger to Thomas Morrison at Meridian Defense read, "Blackout on schedule. Additional targets identified for future neutralization. Congressional hearing postponement confirmed through friendly contacts. Ongoing operations protect $2.3 billion in contracted revenue streams." The scale was breathtaking. This wasn't just about silencing 3 journalists, it was about protecting a systematic theft operation that had been ongoing for years. Every time an investigator got close to exposing the fraud, the intelligence community would fabricate evidence to destroy them. I printed the most incriminating documents using a secure printer in a different building, then used my lunch break to photograph additional evidence with a personal camera. Each document I copied was another federal crime, another step toward my own destruction, but also another piece of proof that could expose the entire conspiracy. Sarah Chen had given me her secure contact information, and I began transmitting documents through encrypted channels. Her responses showed the professional excitement of a journalist who'd stumbled onto the story of a lifetime, combined with the appropriate fear of someone who understood the implications. Elena, these documents are incredible. We now have proof of systematic coordination between intelligence agencies and defense contractors to eliminate threats to their criminal enterprise. But I need you to understand, once we publish this, there will be nowhere for any of us to hide. Are you certain you want to proceed? I responded immediately. Sarah, I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The people running Operation Blackout are domestic enemies who've captured our intelligence agencies for private profit. Publishing this story isn't treason, it's patriotism. While providing documents to Sarah, I also began reaching out to other potential allies within the CIA. Using careful probing during normal work conversations, I tried to identify colleagues who might be willing to support exposure of the conspiracy. What I discovered was terrifying. Most CIA personnel had no idea about Operation Blackout or the broader corruption. The conspiracy was compartmentalized, with only senior officials and specifically recruited operatives aware of the full scope. The majority of CIA employees were honest professionals who believed they were serving legitimate national security objectives, but those honest professionals were being used as cover for criminal operations they didn't know existed. Their genuine patriotism and professional competence provided legitimacy for an organization that had been captured by private interests. I found one potential ally, Jennifer Walsh, the former analyst who'd been forced out for questioning intelligence manipulation. Through careful inquiries, I learned she was still in contact with other former CIA personnel who'd been pushed out for similar reasons. Using a secure phone purchased with cash, I called Jennifer at her home in Vermont. "Jennifer, this is Elena Rodriguez from Counterterrorism. We've never met, but I need to talk to you about why you really left the agency." There was a long pause. "Elena, if you're calling me about intelligence manipulation, your phone is probably monitored and your career is probably over." "My career is already over," I replied, "but I might be able to do something about the people who destroyed yours." Jennifer agreed to meet me that weekend at a coffee shop in Fredericksburg, halfway between Washington and her home. She brought Two other former CIA personnel who'd been similarly forced out, a former Middle East analyst named Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, and a former counterintelligence officer named Maria Santos. Their stories were remarkably similar. Each had identified evidence of systematic corruption, raised concerns through proper channels, and been systematically destroyed through manufactured performance issues, security clearance problems, or forced resignations. It's not just defense contractors, Maria told me. They've been doing this for years with pharmaceutical companies, oil companies, tech firms. Anytime someone gets close to exposing how these companies have captured government agencies, the intelligence community manufactures evidence to destroy them. Robert added, we tried to expose it through proper channels, inspector generals, congressional oversight, even media contacts. But every legitimate outlet we approached was either compromised or too afraid to publish. The system protects itself. Jennifer pulled out a folder containing documents she'd hidden before leaving the CIA. I kept copies of everything, hoping someday someone would be in position to expose it. These show the same patterns you're describing. Going back over a decade, the documents revealed that Operation Blackout was just the latest iteration of systematic attacks on American democracy. Journalists, investigators, prosecutors, and government auditors had been targeted for years using fabricated evidence, planted surveillance, and manufactured scandals. The question, Jennifer said, is whether you have a publication outlet that can't be compromised or threatened into silence. I thought about Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar, three journalists who'd already proven their willingness to investigate powerful interests despite personal risk. I think I do, I replied. But once this story publishes, all of us will be targets. Maria smiled grimly. Elena, we've been targets for years. The difference is that now we might actually be able to fight back. As I drove back to Washington that evening, I realized I was no longer alone. There were other CIA personnel who'd tried to expose the corruption and been destroyed for it. There were journalists willing to risk everything to publish the truth. There were government employees throughout Washington who suspected something was wrong, but hadn't known how to prove it. The conspiracy was massive, but it wasn't invulnerable. It depended on secrecy, compartmentalization, and the silence of its victims. We were about to shatter that silence. Sarah Chen's secure message was waiting when I got home. Elena, we're ready to publish. Final question. Do you want your name in the story as a source, or do you want to remain anonymous? I stared at the message for a long time, understanding that my answer would determine not just my future, but the credibility of the entire expose. Finally, I typed my response. Use my name. If we're going to destroy this conspiracy, we need to show that real CIA officers with real credentials are willing to put their names on the record. The truth deserves witnesses, not just anonymous sources. As I hit send, I realized I'd just ended my career in intelligence and probably made myself a target for elimination, but I'd also just struck the first blow in a war to reclaim American democracy from the criminals who'd captured it. The question was whether we could survive long enough to win. Thursday morning, I knew something was wrong the moment I badged into Langley. The security guard's usual nod was replaced by a longer, more scrutinizing look. The elevator ride felt different. Colleagues who normally made small talk avoided eye contact. My access card required 2 swipes to open the door to my section. I'd been made .at my desk. I found a message from David Kruger. Elena, my office immediately. Bring the blackout materials. My hands shook as I gathered the USB drive and folders, knowing this could be my last moments as a free person. But I also felt a strange calm. Sarah Chen had confirmed that the story would publish that afternoon regardless of what happened to me. Even if they arrested me now, the truth would still come out. Kruger's office felt like a trap the moment I entered. He wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits stood near the window, their posture and bearing obviously CIA security. A woman I didn't recognize sat at a small table with an open laptop and recording equipment. Sit down, Elena, Kruger said, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. We need to discuss some concerning developments in your recent activities. He opened a folder and spread surveillance photos across his desk, images of me at the Fairfax Library, at the University Computer Lab, at the coffee shop in Fredericksburg. Most damning of all, a photo of me talking to Sarah Chen in the Tyson's corner parking garage. Explain these images, Kruger demanded. I'd prepared for this moment, knowing that once Operation Blackout realized their targets had been warned, They would investigate every person with access to the classified materials. But seeing the evidence of their surveillance still felt like a physical blow. I was conducting research related to the blackout assignment, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Kruger pulled out printouts of encrypted email communications. Is this your research? Warning enemy agents about classified operations? Providing classified information to foreign assets? The woman at the table spoke for the first time. Miss Rodriguez, I'm Deputy Director Catherine Walsh from CIA Security. You are currently under investigation for violations of the Espionage Act, providing material support to enemies of the United States, and treason. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The individuals you contacted are not foreign assets, I said. They're American journalists investigating corruption, journalists who have been in contact with foreign intelligence services, Kruger replied. Journalists who have been receiving payments from hostile nations. You provided classified information to people actively working against American interests. I realized they genuinely believed their own fabricated evidence, or were pretending to believe it so convincingly that the distinction didn't matter. To them, Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar were legitimate security threats, not victims of an elaborate frame-up. David, those financial records are fabricated, I said. I've seen the evidence creation files. Operation Blackout is manufacturing evidence against innocent Americans. The security officers exchanged glances. Kruger leaned forward, his expression mixing disappointment with what might have been genuine concern. Elena, you've been compromised. Someone has fed you disinformation designed to make you believe legitimate counterintelligence operations are fabricated. You've been manipulated into betraying your own country. The psychological sophistication was remarkable. They'd created a narrative where my exposure of their conspiracy was actually evidence that I'd been compromised by foreign agents. My patriotic attempt to protect innocent Americans was being reframed as treason orchestrated by our enemies. The evidence you believe you've seen, Deputy Director Walsh continued, was planted to test your loyalty and identify potential security vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, you failed that test spectacularly. She pulled out another folder containing financial records with my name on them, bank statements showing deposits I'd never received, cryptocurrency transactions I'd never made, communications with foreign contacts I'd never met. They were framing me using the same techniques they'd planned to use against the journalists. These records show that you've been receiving payments from Iranian intelligence services for the past 6 months, Walsh said. The same services that have been funding the journalists you contacted. I stared at the fabricated evidence, understanding that I was experiencing exactly what Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar would have faced if Operation Blackout had proceeded as planned. The technical sophistication was flawless bank records that would pass forensic examination, digital communications that appeared authentic, financial patterns that painted a compelling picture of espionage. None of that is real, I said. Your phone records show communications with Iranian operatives, Kruger replied, pulling out call logs. Your computer access shows you've been copying classified documents for months. Your financial records show unexplained income from foreign sources. Every piece of evidence was fabricated, but it was fabricated so well that it would convince prosecutors, juries, and probably most CIA personnel. I was watching the machinery of my own destruction operate with clinical precision. The question, Walsh said, is whether you cooperate with our investigation or compound your crimes by continuing to deny the obvious. I understood the choice they were offering: confess to treason I hadn't committed and implicate the journalists as foreign agents, or maintain my innocence and face prosecution with fabricated evidence that would be virtually impossible to disprove. I need to speak with a lawyer, I said. Elena, Kruger's voice took on an almost paternal tone. Lawyers will only make this worse. We can resolve this quietly if you help us understand how the Iranians recruited you and what information you've provided to their assets in the media. The gentle tone was more frightening than threats would have been. They genuinely believed they were giving me a chance to save myself by confirming their narrative. The operation to neutralize those journalists is legitimate, Walsh added. They are genuine security threats who have been compromised by foreign intelligence. By warning them, you've endangered ongoing operations and potentially cost American lives. I realized that some of the people in this room genuinely believed Operation Blackout was a legitimate counterintelligence operation against real foreign assets. The compartmentalization was so effective that even senior security officials didn't understand they were participating in a conspiracy to silence American journalists investigating corporate corruption. "I want a lawyer," I repeated. Walsh closed her laptop. "Ms. Rodriguez, you are suspended pending investigation. Your security clearance is revoked immediately. Your passport is confiscated. You are not to leave the Washington metropolitan area without permission." One of the security officers approached my desk with a cardboard box, beginning to pack my personal belongings. 9 years of service, hundreds of briefings, thousands of hours protecting American lives, all reduced to the contents of a box that would fit in my car trunk. As they escorted me from the building, I passed colleagues who'd worked alongside me for years. Some looked confused, others appeared sympathetic, a few seemed genuinely angry at what they probably believed was my betrayal of everything we'd sworn to protect. Walking through Langley's corridors for what I knew would be the last time, I thought about the oath I'd taken 9 years ago. I'd sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I was keeping that oath, even if it meant being branded a traitor by the people I'd served alongside. In the parking garage, as I loaded my box into my car, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Story publishes in 2 hours. Your courage won't be forgotten." Sarah Chen had kept her promise. Whatever happened to me now, the truth would survive. As I drove away from CIA headquarters, probably for the last time, I wondered if exposing a conspiracy was worth destroying my life. Then I thought about my parents, proud of their daughter, who'd served her country with honor. They'd raised me to believe that some things were worth any sacrifice. The truth was one of them. The suspension notice arrived at my apartment that evening, delivered by a federal marshal who waited while I read the document that formally ended my intelligence career. "Elena Rodriguez is hereby suspended from all duties and responsibilities within the Central Intelligence Agency pending completion of a security investigation. Subject is prohibited from accessing any CIA facilities, communicating with any CIA personnel, or discussing any classified information with unauthorized individuals." The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were personal and devastating. My security clearance, the foundation of my professional identity for 9 years, was revoked. My government-issued laptop and phone were confiscated. My bank accounts were frozen pending a Treasury Department investigation into the fabricated Iranian payments they'd planted in my financial records. Within hours, I was completely cut off from the life I'd built in Washington. No income, no access to my savings, no professional contacts who were allowed to speak with me. The isolation was immediate and total, but worse than the financial pressure was the psychological warfare. My apartment phone rang constantly with calls from blocked numbers, sometimes silence, sometimes recordings of Iranian voices speaking Farsi, sometimes what sounded like intelligence briefings being conducted in foreign languages. They wanted me to believe I was under surveillance by hostile foreign governments, that my betrayal had exposed me to retaliation from the very people they claimed I'd been working for. The media attention began within hours of Sarah Chen's story, hitting the Washington Post website. "CIA analyst exposes massive defense contractor corruption" was the lead story, accompanied by a photo of me that looked like it had been taken from my personnel file. The article named me as the primary source for revelations about Operation Blackout and the broader conspiracy involving billions in stolen defense funds. My phone, the personal one they hadn't confiscated, started ringing with calls from reporters, book agents, documentary filmmakers, and conspiracy theorists, but also from former colleagues expressing support, family members demanding explanations, and strangers thanking me for exposing the truth. The strangest call came from my mother. "Mija, there are news trucks outside our house. They're saying you're a spy and a hero and a traitor all at the same time. What's happening? How do you explain to your working-class parents that their daughter had just blown up her career to expose systematic corruption by the government she'd sworn to serve? How do you tell them that the agency they'd been proud to see you join was actually a criminal enterprise that had been stealing taxpayer money while American soldiers died from defective equipment?" "Mama, I did what you and Papa raised me to do," I said. "I told the truth when powerful people were hurting innocent Americans. Are you in danger, Elena?" I looked out my apartment window at the black SUV that had been parked across the street since I'd arrived home. "I don't know yet." The financial pressure intensified quickly. With my accounts frozen and no income, I couldn't pay rent, buy groceries, or even put gas in my car. The bureaucratic machinery designed to support CIA personnel had been turned against me with ruthless efficiency. But I wasn't completely alone. Jennifer Walsh called from Vermont. Elena, I've set up a legal defense fund. Former CIA personnel who've been through similar situations are contributing. We're not going to let them destroy you the way they tried to destroy us. The fund raised $47,000 in the first week, mostly small donations from intelligence community, personnel who'd left government service under suspicious circumstances, military veterans who'd been silenced for reporting equipment failures, and ordinary citizens who'd read Sarah Chen's article and understood that someone needed to support whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption. More importantly, the Legal Defense Fund connected me with lawyers who specialized in defending intelligence community whistleblowers. Lisa Martinez, a former federal prosecutor who'd left the Justice Department after witnessing prosecutorial misconduct, agreed to represent me pro bono. Elena, they're going to try to destroy you using the same playbook they've used against dozens of other people, Lisa explained during our first meeting. Fabricated evidence, character assassination, selective prosecution. But this time is different. The evidence you've provided to journalists gives us documentation of their methods. We can prove they've manufactured the case against you. The psychological pressure was relentless. Everywhere I went, I felt watched. My apartment was clearly under surveillance, cars that followed me to the grocery store, strangers who appeared in coffee shops where I tried to work, telephone calls that suggested my conversations were being monitored. But the most insidious pressure came from former colleagues who'd been authorized to contact me. David Kruger called personally. Elena, it's not too late to fix this. We know you were manipulated by foreign agents. Help us understand how they recruited you, and we can make the charges go away. The offer was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. They were giving me a way out: confess to being a dupe of foreign intelligence, implicate the journalists as foreign agents, and return to a version of my old life. All I had to do was lie about everything I'd discovered and betray the people who were risking their lives to expose the truth. David, you know I wasn't recruited by foreign agents, I replied. You know Operation Blackout was designed to frame innocent journalists. You know the evidence against me is fabricated. Elena, you're suffering from a psychological condition common among people who've been compromised by hostile intelligence services. They convinced you that legitimate operations were fabricated, that real evidence was fake. We can get you help. The gaslighting was sophisticated enough that I might have doubted myself if I hadn't seen the original fabrication files with my own eyes. They were trying to convince me that my memories of discovering the conspiracy were actually false memories, implanted by foreign manipulators. As the days passed, I realized the full scope of my isolation. Former colleagues weren't allowed to speak with me. My professional network had been severed completely. My financial resources were frozen. My reputation was being systematically destroyed through strategic leaks to media outlets that painted me as either a traitor or a naive dupe of foreign intelligence. But Sarah Chen's articles kept coming. Each day brought new revelations based on the documents I'd provided, additional sources who'd been inspired by my example to come forward, and mounting evidence of the systematic corruption I'd exposed. The story was growing beyond anything I'd imagined. Marcus Webb published a follow-up article detailing how defense contractor fraud had killed American soldiers. Priya Kumar released financial analysis showing how the conspiracy had stolen over $50 billion in taxpayer money over the past decade. Other journalists began investigating similar patterns involving different agencies and contractors. A week after my suspension, I received a message that changed everything. Elena, congressional hearing scheduled for next month. They want you to testify. Are you willing? As Sarah Chen had done more than publish my story, she'd created enough public pressure to force congressional oversight of the conspiracy I'd exposed. The House Intelligence Committee was convening hearings on Operation Blackout and the broader defense contractor corruption. I would have the chance to tell my story under oath, with legal protection, to elected representatives who had the power to investigate and prosecute the conspiracy I'd discovered. But I would also be painting an even larger target on my back by testifying publicly against some of the most powerful people in the intelligence community. I typed my response. Sarah, yes. Someone needs to speak for the people who've been silenced. I'll testify. As I hit send, I realized I'd just committed to the most dangerous thing I'd ever done in my life, but I'd also just taken the next step toward holding accountable the people who'd betrayed everything they'd sworn to protect. The Question was whether I'd survive long enough to complete that testimony. The Washington Post front page on Sunday morning changed everything. Above the fold, in 72-point type, the headline read, "Operation Blackout: How the CIA Conspired to Frame American Journalists." Below it, Sarah Chen's byline appeared alongside a photo that made my stomach drop: my official CIA headshot, the same one from my security badge, now identifying me to the world as the whistleblower who'd exposed systematic corruption within America's intelligence community. I bought the newspaper from a vending machine outside my apartment building, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. The article was everything Sarah had promised: meticulous, devastating, and undeniable. She'd woven together the classified documents I'd provided, with additional reporting from Marcus Webb and Priya Kumar, to create a comprehensive expose of the largest intelligence community scandal in decades. Elena Rodriguez, a 9-year veteran, intelligence analyst with the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, provided classified documents showing how Operation Blackout was designed to plant fabricated evidence linking 3 American journalists to foreign intelligence services. The article began. The operation was part of a broader conspiracy involving current and former CIA officers working with defense contractor Meridian Defense Corporation to silence critics of systematic fraud that has cost American taxpayers billions of dollars and resulted in the deaths of U.S. service members from defective equipment. The article included photographs of the USB drive, excerpts from Operation Blackout's planning documents, and financial records showing the web of corruption connecting CIA officers to defense contractor executives. Most powerfully, it featured quotes from the 3 targeted journalists and their ongoing investigations into Meridian Defense's fraudulent practices. But what made the story impossible to dismiss was its documentation. Sarah hadn't just reported allegations, she'd provided documentary evidence that could be verified independently. The classified documents I'd leaked bore authentic CIA markings, classification stamps, and digital signatures that proved their legitimacy. Within hours, the story dominated every news cycle. Cable news networks led with breaking CIA corruption scandal, while social media exploded with hashtags like #Operation Blackout and #Defense Contractor Fraud. The story was trending globally, with international news outlets picking up the investigation and connecting it to similar corruption scandals in other countries. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, but I'd agreed with Lisa Martinez, my lawyer, to say nothing publicly until the congressional hearing. Every statement I made could be used against me in the criminal prosecution that seemed increasingly inevitable. The government's response was swift and predictable. A CIA spokesperson issued a statement: "The allegations made by Ms. Rodriguez are being investigated by appropriate authorities." However, her access to classified information was limited, and her interpretation of legitimate counterintelligence operations appears to have been compromised by exposure to foreign disinformation campaigns. The Justice Department was more direct. The department is reviewing evidence suggesting that classified information may have been provided to unauthorized individuals, including potential foreign agents. All appropriate investigative and prosecutorial tools will be employed to protect national security, but the story had created momentum that couldn't be controlled through standard damage control methods. Within 48 hours, 17 members of Congress had called for investigations into Operation Blackout. The House Intelligence Committee announced hearings. The Senate Armed Services Committee opened an inquiry into defense contractor fraud. 3 different inspectors general launched reviews of their respective agencies' involvement. Most significantly, other sources began coming forward. Former CIA personnel who'd been forced out for questioning similar operations contacted journalists with their own evidence. Current intelligence officers reached out through secure channels to provide additional documentation of corruption. Military personnel shared stories about equipment failures that had killed their colleagues. The floodgates had opened. Marcus Webb's follow-up article, published Tuesday, detailed 17 specific cases where Meridian defense equipment had failed in combat, resulting in 43 American casualties. His reporting included interviews with surviving service members, medical records, and internal company documents showing that executives had known about the defects but continued shipping equipment to maximize profits. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, no relation to journalist Sarah Chen, lost both legs when his Meridian-built armored vehicle failed to protect against an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan, Webb wrote. Internal company emails show that Meridian executives knew their armor plating was 23% thinner than specifications required, but calculated that lawsuit settlements would cost less than production delays. Priya Kumar's financial analysis, published Wednesday, traced $2.3 billion in fraudulent defense contracts through offshore accounts controlled by current and former government officials. Her reporting showed how the conspiracy had systematically looted taxpayer money while providing substandard equipment to American forces. The financial network uncovered by Operation BLACKOUT documents represents the largest theft of public funds in American history. Kumar wrote, "Defense contractors haven't just been overcharging the government, they've been paying government officials to help them steal taxpayer money while American soldiers died from defective equipment." The public reaction was unlike anything I'd expected. My apartment building's mailbox overflowed with letters from strangers, some supportive, others threatening, most simply expressing shock that such corruption was possible within American intelligence agencies. A letter from a Gold Star mother in Ohio read, "Miss Rodriguez, my son died in Iraq when his Meridian Communications radio failed during an ambush. For 3 years, I've been trying to get answers about why the equipment didn't work. Thank you for having the courage to expose the truth." Kevin's death wasn't combat, it was murder for profit, but not all reactions were supportive. Death threats arrived daily, some obviously from cranks, but others sophisticated enough to suggest professional origins. My apartment was vandalized twice, windows broken, threatening messages spray painted on the door. The black SUV surveillance became more obvious, almost intimidating in its visibility. The psychological pressure was designed to break me before the congressional hearing. Anonymous callers told me that former CIA personnel who'd testified against the agency had suffered accidents, car crashes, home invasions, sudden illnesses that couldn't be explained medically. Elena Rodriguez will never make it to that hearing. One caller said in an electronically disguised voice, "Traitors don't get to destroy the people who've dedicated their lives to protecting America, but the threats only reinforce my determination to testify." Every intimidation attempt proved that the conspiracy was real, dangerous, and desperate to prevent exposure. Sarah Chen called Friday evening, "Elena, the story is bigger than we imagined. We're getting tips about similar operations targeting environmental activists, civil rights lawyers, and congressional investigators. This isn't just about defense contractors, it's about systematic weaponization of intelligence capabilities against American democracy." I looked out my window at the SUV that had become a permanent fixture on my street. "Sarah, I think they're going to try to stop me from testifying. Elena, half the country is watching this story now. If something happens to you, it will only prove everything we've exposed. They can't silence you without confirming that everything you've revealed is true." As I hung up, I realized that my safety now depended on publicity. The more attention my case received, the harder it would be for the conspiracy to eliminate me quietly. The congressional hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I had 4 days to stay alive and prepare testimony that could bring down the largest criminal conspiracy in American government history. The question was whether the conspiracy would allow me to reach that hearing, or whether they'd decide that silencing me permanently was worth the risk of confirming everything I'd exposed. Either way, the truth was now public record. Even if they destroyed me, they couldn't destroy what I'd already revealed. Tuesday morning, I walked up the marble steps of the Rayburn House office building knowing that my testimony could either vindicate everything I'd sacrificed or destroy what remained of my credibility. The House Intelligence Committee hearing room was packed with journalists, congressional staff, and spectators who'd lined up since dawn for the limited public seating. Camera flashes erupted as I entered with Lisa Martinez, my attorney. The committee chair, Representative Sarah Williams of California, called the hearing to order with unusual gravity. "Today we examine allegations that intelligence community resources have been weaponized against American journalists investigating legitimate government corruption. These are among the most serious charges ever brought against our intelligence agencies." I was sworn in using the same oath I'd taken 9 years earlier when joining the CIA, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now testifying against my former colleagues to uphold the same principles they'd asked me to betray. "Miss Rodriguez," Representative Williams began, "please state your background and explain why you've come before this committee." I leaned into the microphone, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Madam Chairwoman, I am Elena Rodriguez. I served as a senior intelligence analyst with the CIA's Counterterrorism Center for 9 years. I am here today because I discovered that my agency was planning to fabricate evidence against American journalists whose only crime was investigating corruption that has cost taxpayers billions of dollars and cost American service members their lives. For the next 40 minutes, I walked the committee through Operation Blackout in methodical detail. I explained how I'd been handed the USB drive containing fabricated evidence against Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb, and Priya Kumar. I described the sophisticated methods planned to frame innocent journalists as foreign agents. I detailed the financial conspiracy connecting CIA officers to defense contractor executives. Representative James Morrison of Texas, the ranking Republican member, questioned my credibility. Ms. Rodriguez, isn't it true that you yourself received payments from Iranian intelligence services? Congressman, those financial records are fabricated using the same techniques that were planned for use against the targeted journalists. I can provide technical analysis showing how those documents were manufactured, but you admit you've provided classified information to unauthorized individuals? I provided evidence of criminal activity to journalists investigating that criminal activity. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. That oath required me to expose a conspiracy that was attacking the First Amendment rights of American citizens. The most powerful moment came when Representative Williams displayed classified documents I'd provided to Sarah Chen on large screens visible to the hearing room and television cameras. Ms. Rodriguez, can you explain this document marked Operation Blackout Financial Fabrication Timeline? Madam Chairwoman, that document shows the planned schedule for planning fabricated bank records in Sarah Chen's personal accounts. The records would show $50,000 in payments from accounts allegedly controlled by Iranian intelligence. The timeline shows when the fake evidence would be discovered by FBI financial investigators and when it would be leaked to media outlets to destroy Ms. Chen's credibility. Representative Williams displayed another document, and this one marked Psychological Profile Target Alpha. That document analyzes Sarah Chen's personality and identifies psychological pressure points that could be exploited during interrogation. It recommends threatening her family members and using her childhood trauma to break down her resistance to confessing to crimes she didn't commit. The hearing room was completely silent as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to the viewing public. These weren't abstract policy failures, they were documented plans to psychologically torture American journalists into confessing to fabricated crimes. Representative Morrison tried a different approach. Ms. Rodriguez, how do we know you haven't been recruited by foreign intelligence services to discredit legitimate counterterrorism operations? I'd anticipated this question and prepared for it carefully. Congressman, I invite the committee to review my complete financial records, communications history, and personal relationships. I've voluntarily submitted to polygraph examination by independent experts. I've provided documentation that can be verified by technical experts from multiple agencies. Most importantly, every prediction I made about this conspiracy has been confirmed by subsequent events. What predictions? I told journalist Sarah Chen that evidence would be planted in her financial records within 72 hours. I predicted that Marcus Webb and Priya Kumar would face similar fabricated evidence. I warned that the conspiracy involved current CIA officers receiving payments from defense contractors. All of these predictions have been confirmed by independent investigation. Representative Williams asked the crucial question, Ms. Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, was Operation Blackout an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern? Madam Chairwoman, based on classified documents I reviewed before my suspension, Operation Blackout was just the latest iteration of systematic attacks on American democracy. Similar operations have targeted environmental activists investigating corporate pollution, civil rights lawyers challenging government misconduct, and congressional investigators examining agency budgets. The intelligence community has been captured by private interests and is being used to attack American citizens who threaten corporate profits. The committee's Democratic members asked detailed questions about the financial conspiracy, the extent of CIA officer involvement, and the methods used to fabricate evidence. The Republican members focused on national security implications and whether my disclosures had damaged ongoing operations. But the most emotionally powerful testimony came when Representative Williams asked about my motivations. Ms. Rodriguez, you've destroyed your career and risked federal prosecution to expose this conspiracy. Why? I thought about my parents, about Sarah Chen saving my hometown, about the Marines who died from defective equipment, about the oath I'd taken to defend the Constitution. Madam Chairwoman, I joined the CIA because I believed it protected American democracy from its enemies. When I discovered that my agency was attacking American democracy to protect the profits of corrupt corporations, I had to choose between my career and my country. I chose my country. The hearing concluded with Representative Williams announcing that the committee would subpoena all documents related to Operation Blackout and launch a comprehensive investigation into intelligence community corruption. I left the hearing room surrounded by security officers and journalists. I realized I'd just provided sworn testimony that would either lead to the largest intelligence community reform in American history or mark me as the biggest traitor since Edward Snowden. But walking down those marble steps, I felt something. I hadn't experienced since receiving that USB drive 3 weeks earlier. Pride in my service to America. For the first time in my intelligence career, I was actually protecting American democracy instead of the interests that had captured it. Sarah Chen was waiting at the bottom of the steps with a smile that made all the risks worthwhile. Elena, you just changed history. I looked back at the Capitol dome, thinking about the Constitution I'd sworn to defend and the democracy I'd tried to protect. Sarah, I just kept a promise I made 9 years ago. The question now was whether that promise would be enough to save the country I'd sworn to serve. 6 months after my congressional testimony, I watched from the federal courthouse steps as David Kruger was led away in handcuffs. The man who'd been my supervisor, mentor, and ultimately my would-be destroyer, was now facing 23 federal charges including conspiracy, bribery, fraud, and violations of the Espionage Act, the same charges he'd threatened to bring against me. The Department of Justice had moved with unprecedented speed once congressional pressure made inaction impossible. A special prosecutor had been appointed within a week of my testimony. Grand juries were impaneled in 3 districts. FBI raids on CIA facilities, defense contractor offices, and private residences had yielded thousands of documents that confirmed every allegation I'd made under oath. The indictment against Kruger and 17 co-conspirators read like a catalog of systematic corruption from approximately 2015 to 2024. Defendants engaged in a criminal enterprise designed to eliminate threats to defense contractor profits through fabrication of evidence, abuse of intelligence community resources, and obstruction of congressional oversight. But the most satisfying moment came when I read the specific charges against Thomas Morrison, Meridian Defense Corporation's vice president for government relations: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to commit murder of U.S. service members through provision of defective equipment, and conspiracy to violate the civil rights of American journalists through fabrication of evidence, murder charges. The Justice Department had finally acknowledged that defense contractor fraud wasn't just financial crime, it was homicide. When companies knowingly provided defective equipment to American soldiers, they were committing murder for profit. The congressional investigation had uncovered evidence far beyond what I'd originally provided. 17 current and former CIA officers had been arrested. 12 FBI agents faced charges for participating in evidence fabrication. 8 NSA analysts were under investigation for illegal surveillance of American journalists. The Meridian Defense Corporation itself faced $4.7 billion in criminal fines and was banned from receiving federal contracts pending resolution of the charges. 3 competing defense contractors had been awarded emergency contracts to replace Meridian's defective equipment, potentially saving hundreds of American lives. But the most important consequence was structural reform. The House Intelligence Committee had passed the Elena Rodriguez Whistleblower Protection Act legislation requiring independent oversight of all intelligence community operations targeting American citizens, creating legal protections for intelligence officers who reported misconduct, and establishing criminal penalties for officials who retaliated against whistleblowers. This legislation ensures that no intelligence officer will ever again face the choice between their career and their conscience, Representative Williams had said during the signing ceremony. Elena Rodriguez's courage has shown us that protecting democracy sometimes requires defending it against its own protectors. The personal cost had been enormous. My security clearance would never be restored. My intelligence career was permanently over. I'd spent 6 months under federal investigation before prosecutors finally acknowledged that the evidence against me had been fabricated. My reputation in the intelligence community was permanently damaged among colleagues who still believed I'd betrayed legitimate operations, but there had been unexpected benefits. The legal defense fund had grown to over $200,000, providing financial security during the investigation. Book publishers had offered advances for my memoir. Documentary filmmakers wanted to tell my story. Speaking agencies invited me to address corporate ethics conferences and intelligence community reform panels. Most importantly, I'd found a new sense of purpose. Georgetown University had offered me a position teaching intelligence, ethics, and constitutional law. Students who wanted to serve their country but do so with integrity flocked to my classes, eager to learn how to navigate the moral complexities of intelligence work. My first lecture each semester began with the same question: how do you serve your country when your country's institutions have been captured by interests that oppose everything your country is supposed to represent? It was the question I'd faced in that cubicle at Langley, staring at a USB drive containing plans to destroy innocent Americans. It was the question every intelligence officer would eventually face in a democracy where private interests competed with public service. The answer, I told my students, was simple in principle but difficult in practice. You serve the Constitution and the American people, not the institutions that claim to represent them. Sometimes that means working within the system. Sometimes it means working against the system. But it always means keeping faith with the principles that make democracy worth defending. Sarah Chen had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on Operation BLACKOUT. Marcus Webb's investigation into defense contractor fraud had led to congressional hearings that resulted in $12 billion in recovered taxpayer funds. Priya Kumar's financial analysis had triggered reforms of Pentagon procurement procedures that would prevent similar fraud for years to come. The 3 journalists I'd been ordered to destroy had become the most celebrated investigative reporters of their generation, proving that attacking the messenger could never suppress the message when the message was true. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Gold Star Families Association, an organization of parents whose children had died in military service, had presented me with their Defender of the Fallen award for exposing the corporate negligence that had killed American service members. Elena Rodriguez didn't just expose corruption, the association's president had said during the ceremony. She honored the memory of every service member who died because corporations prioritized profits over their lives. I'd accepted the award, thinking about Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, who'd lost his legs to an eye because Meridian Defense had provided substandard armor plating. About the 3 Marines who died in Marcus Webb's unit when their communications equipment failed. About the 43 American casualties that could have been prevented if corporate executives had prioritized soldier safety over quarterly earnings. Their sacrifice hadn't been in vain if my testimony helped prevent future deaths from defective equipment. As I walked across Georgetown's campus toward my next class, Constitutional Ethics and Intelligence Operations, I thought about the oath I'd taken 9 years ago, and how much my understanding of it had evolved. I'd thought I was swearing to defend America's institutions. I'd learned that I was actually swearing to defend America's principles, even when that meant challenging America's institutions. The distinction had cost me everything I'd thought I wanted from my career, but it had given me everything I'd actually needed from my life: the knowledge that when democracy was threatened, I'd stood up to defend it. That was worth any price I'd had to pay. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. Elena, new investigation starting into pharmaceutical company corruption. Interested in consulting? I smiled, realizing that my real career was just beginning. Some fights were worth fighting forever. Democracy was one of them. 1 year later, I stood in the same Georgetown lecture hall where Professor Williams had first approached me about serving my country 20 years ago. But now I was the professor, and the students looking up at me represented the next generation of Americans who would have to choose between institutional loyalty and moral courage. Intelligence work, I told them, is fundamentally about distinguishing truth from lies in an environment where both can look identical. The most dangerous moment in any analyst's career comes when you realize that the lies might be coming from inside your own organization. My teaching contract had become permanent, with tenure track consideration next year. The university had created a new program in intelligence ethics and democratic accountability, with me as its founding director. Students came from all over the world to study how intelligence agencies could serve democracy instead of undermining it, but my real satisfaction came from the individual students who approached me after class, wrestling with the same moral complexities I'd faced. Former military officers who'd witnessed contractor fraud, young idealists considering intelligence careers, mid-career professionals who'd discovered corruption in their agencies. Professor Rodriguez, a former Navy lieutenant, asked after my lecture on institutional capture, "What do you do when you know your superiors are wrong, but speaking up will end your career?" "You ask yourself a different question," I replied. "What's the point of having a career that requires you to betray everything you believe in? Sometimes losing the wrong career is the first step toward finding the right life." The question reflected my own journey from loyal CIA analyst to democracy defender. The career I'd lost at Langley had been replaced by something more meaningful, the chance to shape how future intelligence officers would navigate the ethical challenges I'd faced. My memoir, The Oath, a CIA analyst's choice between career and country, had been published 6 months ago to significant attention. The book tour had taken me to university campuses, intelligence community conferences, and government reform panels across the country, but the most meaningful event had been a book signing at a military base in Virginia, where I'd met Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, the Marine who'd lost his legs to an eye because of Meridian Defense's defective armor plating. "Miss Rodriguez," he'd said, rolling up to my table in his wheelchair, "I wanted to thank you. Because of your testimony, my little brother is deploying next month with equipment that might actually protect him." That conversation reminded me why the personal costs had been worth it. Every intelligence officer who might now think twice before participating in corruption, every journalist who might be safer from fabricated prosecution, every soldier who might survive because contractors couldn't sacrifice safety for profit. Sarah Chen had become more than a source, she'd become a friend and occasional collaborator. Her continued investigations into government corruption had benefited from my insights into intelligence community operations. Together, we'd exposed pharmaceutical companies buying influence at the FDA, oil companies capturing environmental agencies, and tech companies purchasing surveillance capabilities from intelligence contractors. "Elena," she'd said during our most recent lunch, "you've become more dangerous to corruption as a professor than you ever were as a CIA analyst. That's because I'm finally serving the Constitution instead of the institutions that claim to represent it." The legal consequences for Operation BLACKOUT's conspirators had been severe, but not universal. David Kruger had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Thomas Morrison received 12 years. 17 CIA officers faced sentences ranging from probation to 8 years imprisonment, but some had escaped accountability through plea bargains, immunity agreements, and classified proceedings that kept their crimes hidden from public scrutiny. The system's capacity for self-protection remained formidable. More troubling, similar patterns had emerged at other agencies. My teaching had attracted whistleblowers from the DEPA, SEC, and other federal agencies who'd discovered comparable corruption in their organizations. The problem wasn't limited to the intelligence community, it was systematic across government. Democracy, I'd written in my memoir's conclusion, isn't a system you can inherit and expect to maintain itself. Each generation must choose whether to defend it or allow it to be captured by interests that oppose everything democracy is supposed to represent. That choice now defined my daily work. Every student I taught might someday face the decision I'd confronted: serve the institution or serve the principles the institution was supposed to protect. My phone rang with a call from Jennifer Walsh, the former CIA analyst who'd been forced out for questioning intelligence manipulation and had first connected me with other whistleblowers. "Elena, I wanted you to be the first to know the Inspector General just opened an investigation into the pharmaceutical corruption we reported. Your consulting work helped make the case. 6 different agencies were now investigating systematic corruption that had emerged from the networks we'd exposed through Operation BLACKOUT. The accountability was expanding beyond defense contractors to encompass the broader capture of government institutions by private interests." "Jennifer, do you ever regret speaking up?" "Every day," she laughed. "And every day I'm glad I did. Democracy is messy, dangerous work, but someone has to do it." As I prepared for my afternoon seminar on constitutional obligations and intelligence work, I thought about the oath I'd taken 9 years ago and how completely my understanding of it had evolved. I'd thought I was swearing loyalty to American institutions, I'd learned I was actually swearing loyalty to American principles that sometimes required challenging American institutions. The distinction had transformed my understanding of patriotism itself. Love of country wasn't about supporting government actions, it was about holding government accountable to the values that made the country worth loving. My students would face the same evolution of understanding. Some would choose institutional loyalty over moral courage. Others would choose conscience over career. A few might find ways to serve both principles and institutions, but all of them would face the choice. Walking across Georgetown's campus toward my classroom, I passed the building where Professor Williams had recruited me 20 years ago. The naive young woman who'd believed that serving her country meant obeying her superiors felt like a different person entirely. She'd been replaced by someone who understood that serving your country sometimes meant saving it from its own institutions. The question for my students and for every American was whether they would have the courage to make that choice when their moment came. Democracy depended on people who would choose truth over comfort, principle over profit, and conscience over career. I'd made that choice. Now it was their turn. The classroom was full of eager faces, young people who wanted to serve their country with honor and integrity. They represented hope for a democracy that could be reformed, institutions that could be reclaimed, and a government that could actually serve the people instead of the interests that had captured it. Today, I told them, we're going to discuss the most important question in intelligence work: how do you serve your country when your country's institutions have lost their way? It was the question that had defined my life. It was the question that would define theirs. The answer would determine whether American democracy survived the century or became another historical example of how republics die when their citizens choose comfort over courage. I looked at my students and felt something I hadn't experienced since reading Sarah Chen's first article about the water crisis in my hometown. Hope that truth could still triumph over power, that courage could still overcome corruption, and that ordinary people could still hold extraordinary institutions accountable to the principles they were supposed to serve. The oath I'd taken 9 years ago was still binding. I was still defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I was just doing it from a different battlefield now, and the war for democracy's soul continued.